All right, so Dan Taylor is going to be our guest speaker today. His new book on lights, camera, fastball, how the Hollywood Stars changed baseball. Look at the Hollywood Stars and their glorious 20-year run in the Pacific Coast League. He'll be telling us about that. The book is out on, you said, Rowan Littlefield?
Roman Littlefield is the publisher, and it's out there on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and Roman's website, which is ROWMAN.com. So.
Okay. All right, so take it away, Dan.
Well, RJ, thank you very much. Hi, everybody. Thanks for it's as big a treat for me, really, to be able to talk about the Hollywood Stars as it has been to research and write lights, camera, fastball, how the Hollywood Stars changed baseball. A few years ago, I was very fortunate to be asked to collaborate with the legendary scout George Genovese on his autobiography, A Scout's Report. And George and I became great friends and spent a lot of time together. And it seemed like in many of our conversations, things would crop up about the Hollywood Stars. George played shortstop for them in 1949, their pennant-winning season, their first pennant-winning season. And then again in 1951, sandwiched around a brief stint with the Washington Senators. And we'd be at Dodger Stadium or watching a game or having conversation about a game. And invariably, George would point out something, or we'd be discussing something, and George would say, well, we did that at Hollywood, or that came from Hollywood, or we started that at Hollywood. And it really piqued my curiosity. And a few friends that were baseball historians, I would run these things by them, and it was really news to them. And it got me thinking that if these things really were true, that the people who were responsible for bringing them into baseball never got the credit they were due. And so that next thing I knew, why the shirt sleeves were rolled up, and I was on the deep dive into researching the Hollywood Stars. And I think, like many of you, I have always considered the Hollywood Stars to be the glamour team of baseball, which they really were. They were owned by a group of movie stars, some of the biggest names in the industry: Bing Crosby, Gene Autry, Barbara Stanwyck, Cecil B. DeMille, and they were supported by the biggest stars in Hollywood. You could go to a game on any night, and you'd have Clark Gable sitting there, Bing Crosby, Mickey Rooney, on and on and on. Bat days, for instance, Gary Cooper, Barbara Stanwyck, Bing Crosby, they would help out and pass out the souvenir bats, as the fans came through the turnstiles. So the celebrities were very, very much involved. But what has really been overshadowed by that whole celebrity reputation of the Hollywood Stars are the many, many things that they brought to baseball. I'm talking about television. In 1940, their opening day game, March 30th, 1940, they carried it live and on a local experimental channel in Los Angeles. There were only 200 sets in Southern California at that time. Television was still an experimental medium. And the Stars experimented on Channel 9. And it went over so well that 20 miles away in the town of Long Beach, there was a shop where the shop owner put a set in the window, and such a big crowd gathered to watch this opening day game that it spilled out into the streets and blocked traffic. And the police actually had to be called to clear the crowd away to allow traffic to pass again. The Stars were the first minor league team to put a game on television, and the first team outside of New York City. The Giants and Dodgers in September of '39 had experimented doing a game on television. And then Hollywood in March of 1940 followed the Brooklyn Dodgers and New York Giants in tackling television. And of course, television was put on hold during the war years. And after the war, Hollywood really plunged. I mean, they televised every home game, and it became somewhat controversial. Hollywood Stars were the first team to fly. Your major league clubs really frowned on it. There was a concern by the league presidents that an aviation disaster could wipe out an entire ball club, and they discouraged their clubs from flying. Hollywood, they had no problems with it. In fact, they didn't just fly. When they went to Seattle or Portland or San Francisco or Oakland or Sacramento, they flew by charter. They struck a deal with Western Airlines, some advertising in exchange, and the Hollywood Stars flew by charter to their away games. Of course, the 1950 season, long be remembered, when the Hollywood Stars introduced a whole new fashion trend. They played 3 seasons wearing short pants. In fact, when Bill Veeck in the early 70s had his Chicago White Sox wear short pants, he paid tribute because he called the shorts Hollywood pants. But some of the Hollywood players were not real happy about it. In fact, when I was researching the book, I had a great chat with Sandy Oster, who was the bat boy that season for Hollywood. And he was in the room when Fred Haney, the manager, broke out the uniforms. And I asked him what the reaction was, and he said, a lot of anger. And I said, well, who was the most upset? And he said, well, that's easy. It was the guys who had the ugliest legs. That Fred Haney employed a running game. He loved to steal and hit and run and squeeze. In fact, they won 10 games that season on squeeze plays. And Carlos Bernier was a guy who ran a lot. And so he was one of the most vocal about getting rid of the shorts because his legs were the ones getting torn up the most. And ultimately, in the 52 season, they did phase out the shorts. But when they introduced them in 50, a number of minor league clubs, particularly in the South where it was especially hot, they jumped on the bandwagon, as did some colleges in California. So the Stars got a lot of attention for shorts. There's a few things today that we see in baseball that came from Hollywood Stars. One, your big league clubs especially, but a lot of your minor league clubs like to introduce every year a new gourmet food item. Well, that really came from Hollywood. They, when they started up the new ownership group, the celebrity ownership group in '39, they tried to cater to the celebrities, and they were real sticklers about the quality of food that they served. And every year they tried to introduce something new and unique. One year it was a bag of fresh roasted peanuts with a prize in the bag. And then the next year it was they called the electrocuted Frankfurter. And judging by things I do with my microwave, I can only wonder how that went over. And then another year it was fresh made donuts, 6 to a bag for a dime. So they were always doing innovative things. And then one of the things that we see in every game, college, minor league, professional, came from the Hollywood Stars and also started in 1950. And that is the middle inning pause to drag the infield. And it started in Hollywood because the Stars had a pitcher by the name of Jack Salveson, who was really at the end of his career. And he knew that to have any success, he had to keep the hitters off balance. And for him, that meant working fast. Well, by working fast, he made the games go fast. And on the nights that he was the starting pitcher, Hollywood's revenue at the concession stands took a big dive. And so the powers that be racked their heads to try to figure out what to do to counter this issue. And they came up with the idea to create they wanted a 10-minute intermission that would allow fans the chance to get to the concession stands. And they pitched the idea to groom the infield and have this pause. They pitched it to the Coast League, and the Coast League rejected it. And then they took it to minor league baseball, and minor league baseball didn't like it, and they turned it down. And they ultimately ended up going to the Rules Committee, and the Rules Committee agreed to let them experiment with it over the second half of the 1950 season. And by 1951, almost everybody in the game was doing it, and it's been a staple of baseball ever since. Where did it come from? Well, it came from a guy at the very top of the ball club, and he's a guy who may have touched each of your life, and you don't even know it. The man's name was Bob Cobb. And Bob Cobb was the owner of the most famous restaurant in the world at that time, the Brown Derby in Hollywood. And how has he touched your life? Well, Bob Cobb was the creator of the Cobb salad. So see the Cobb salad, not for Ty Cobb, but it does have baseball connections. And Bob Cobb was a real entrepreneurial guy and just did an amazing job creating the Brown Derby, and the location of it on Vine near Hollywood was just down the street from where all the movie studios and the radio studios were in the 20s and 30s. And at lunchtime, the directors, the celebrities, they would pour into the Brown Derby. And Cobb got to understand their interests and their habits. And he knew that quality was important to them, but he also knew that if they weren't happy about something, they would never complain. They simply would not come back. So when he had the opportunity to buy the ball club, the principles that he employed with the Brown Derby, he brought to the ballpark. And the way this thing came to be, he almost didn't take advantage of the opportunity. He was a great sportsman. He loved baseball. He was an outdoorsman. He competed annually in the trap and skeet shoot championships. But in 1938, they had moved the missions from San Francisco down to Los Angeles, renamed them the Hollywood Stars. And the owner of the club, who was a San Francisco attorney, lost a series of major lawsuits to investors at his bank, and was really forced to liquidate his holdings. And an attorney who did some work for him in Southern California was also Cobb's attorney, and he got a 72-hour exclusive negotiating window. Well, at a meeting, he passed the note about it to Cobb. Cobb was so busy in the meeting, he didn't look at it. He just stuffed it on his desk. And then just a few hours from the end of this negotiating window, he happened to open it up and realize the opportunity before him. And he pounced on it and told his attorney, let's do this. We'll buy the ball club. And he immediately started making phone calls. The first call went to the director, Cecil B. DeMille, who was in and agreed to join. And then within 36 hours, he had something like 24 movie stars, directors, producers on board. And the plan they put together was each could purchase one single share in this company. The share was $7,000, and they raised a bit over $200,000. 40,000 bought the ball club. 100,000 was set aside to build a ballpark. And they paired it with an oil man by the name of Earl Gilmore, who had a lot of land and in the Fairfax district of Los Angeles. And Earl Gilmore put up 100,000 and oversaw construction, and that's how Gilmore Field came to be. And then with the rest of the money, they set it aside to improve the ball club. And the 38 Hollywood Stars under the previous ownership had been terrible, and in such a bad way, ability-wise and financial-wise, that at one point in the season, the trunks, the equipment and uniform trunks did not get loaded on the train to an away game, and they had to forfeit the first game of a road trip because they didn't have uniforms. And the league fined them for it, and the team was in such a bad way financially, they had to sell a player or two to raise the money to pay the fine. So Cobb and his group came in, bought the ball club, and immediately the manager of the club had already left town for the winter meetings, the baseball winter meetings, when the sale happened. They cabled him in New Orleans at the winter meetings, and they told him, here's the amount of money you've got to spend. And he immediately, one of the first players he bought was Babe Herman. And that was a huge move for Hollywood to bring in Babe Herman, because he was from Southern California. He was an icon in Southern California, tremendous talent, though he was at the end of his career. But it gave credibility to the franchise. And Cobb understood the motion picture industry, and he realized bringing Babe Herman in brought the team star power. So when he built the ballpark, he put amenities in that would cater to the celebrities, their box seats. They actually had backing and sides for privacy. They had a VIP lounge beneath the ballpark. And before games for the celebrities, they would have a buffet meal. They would have a live band. They would have an open bar. I talked to Paul Pettit, and when he was being wooed coming out of high school in 49 and 50, Hollywood Scout actually took a wild shot and brought Paul to Gilmore Field. And Paul said the only thing that he said, nothing he said was remembered, nothing that happened was remembered, except they took me into that VIP lounge, and I was mesmerized by the woman on the arms of George Raft, the legendary actor. But that was what the environment was all about. It was just an amazing environment, and Cobb saw to it that everything was of a high caliber and a high quality. For the ball club, things really changed in 49 when Fred Haney was made the manager, and they struck a deal with Branch Rickey and the Brooklyn Dodgers, and they got better players, and that's when they won their first pennant, and they went on an outstanding run, some of the best, maybe the best 5-year run in the history of the Coast League, winning 3 pennants. And then when Branch Rickey left the Dodgers for the Pittsburgh Pirates, Hollywood shifted their allegiance and became a Pirates farm club. And when Branch Rickey ultimately was pushed out by the Pirates, Hollywood made him the chairman of the board, of their board of directors, in 1956-57. And that was interesting because initially when Fred Haney told Bob Cobb he wanted to align with Brooklyn, Cobb wanted nothing to do with it because in the Coast League were a number of men who in other baseball jobs had dealt with Branch Rickey and did not like it. And so Cobb was very wary, very apprehensive. And he and Fred Haney flew to Brooklyn, had a long session with Branch Rickey. Rickey answered all their questions and really won Cobb over to the point where they became the best of friends. They would go fishing together, they would go hunting together, and ultimately in 56, 57, they elected Branch Rickey the chairman of the board of the Hollywood Stars. One thing that Cobb is responsible for that we see today in baseball that I think really surprised the heck out of me as I was researching this, and maybe surprised me more than anything else that I uncovered, was that Bob Cobb and the Hollywood Stars are really responsible for Dodger Stadium. Coming out of World War II, the Pacific Coast League began 3 attempts to gain major league status. They felt that they were major league caliber and that baseball needed to come to the West Coast. And so they pitched joining the major leagues, gaining major league status. Well, under Happy Chandler, they were really rejected out of hand. But later, the subsequent commissioner met with them and developed guidelines. And Ford Frick developed a whole set of criteria for gaining major league status. And Frick said, we're not going to bring in 1 or 2 teams. If we expand, it will be by bringing in an entire league. And so the criteria that he laid out for the 8 Pacific Coast League teams had one glaring problem for those teams, and that was the quality of their ballparks. They did not meet major league standards, with the exception of the Los Angeles Angels, who played in the Los Angeles version of Wrigley Field. And that ballpark, that was acceptable and met major league standards. But none of the other parks did. Well, one day in 1952, Cobb was up in Chavez Ravine. He was invited to the police academy. The chief of police wanted to put in a banqueting setup in the police academy and wanted Cobb to come in and give him some advice. And Cobb went for a walk up in the hills outside the police academy and was struck. He immediately thought this was the perfect place for a ballpark. And he went the next day, brought a friend up, Bill Schroeder, longtime historian, and Schroeder agreed that the area was going to one day be served by 3 freeways. And the feeling was there was ample land, the layout of the land was perfect, and this was an ideal spot for a ballpark. So Cobb engaged an architect, a renowned architect, Styles O. Clements, and one of his many projects you may be familiar of if you around the holidays watch It's a Wonderful Life, and there's the great scene where the gym floor opens up and they fall into a swimming pool. Well, that building was designed by Styles Clements, among many others in Southern California. And so Clements came up with what he called a plan for a super modern ballpark. And this was one of my biggest frustrations in this project, was somewhere there has to be those drawings, and I could not find them. They were presented to the county supervisors and to the city council in Los Angeles in 1953, but it was miles ahead of anything in baseball at that time. They initially designed it to seat 25,000, but they structured it so it could be increased to 50,000 if they gained major league status. The stadium was going to have 2 restaurants. It was going to have a cocktail lounge, and it was going to have childcare. And one of the amenities that they designed was really unheard of at that time, and is very common now. They called them cabanas. We now call them suites. So there was a design that was just way ahead of its time. But Cobb struggled to get any support from either the city or from the county. The county liked his idea, but they didn't want to do it there. They wanted it in another area of Southern California, which didn't work for Cobb. And the city, the mayor was pretty vocal in saying that he didn't feel the Coast League had a chance to gain major league status. But when the A's moved from Philadelphia to Kansas City, there had been a number of people in Los Angeles claiming that they were going to buy that ball club and bring it to Los Angeles. And when it didn't happen, the mayor took a lot of criticism because Del Webb, who at that time was a part owner of the Yankees, revealed that the men who came and pitched Los Angeles didn't show any money. And Paul Zimmerman, the sports editor and the columnist in the Los Angeles Times, really excoriated these men and said, you don't buy major league ball clubs with talk, you buy it with money. And the mayor during this brouhaha happened to give a talk at a meeting, and to take the heat off, he announced that he had a plan for a ballpark and that he was going to see to it that Los Angeles got Major League Baseball. And he held up a drawing and he said, this is my plan. We're going to build a ballpark in Chavez Ravine. And the drawing he held up was Cobb's and Styles Clement's drawing. So Cobb knew at that point he was a beaten man. He very enthusiastically supported bringing Major League Baseball to Los Angeles, although when Bill Veeck came out to try and pursue the idea of bringing the St. Louis Browns to Los Angeles, Cobb fought it. Cobb spoke at the city council meeting. He spoke at the county supervisors meeting and told them that this was a bad ball club and it was not the type of an operation that Los Angeles should accept. When Walter O'Malley made his fact-finding visit to Los Angeles in the fall of '56, he told all the city leaders that he was not going to meet with any of them until he first met privately with Bob Cobb. And so not long after Mr. O'Malley touched down in Los Angeles, he and Bob Cobb met in Mr. O'Malley's suite at the Stadler Hilton, and Cobb brought the Styles Clements drawings and the blueprints and brought the schematics showing the future plans for the freeway system. And when O'Malley completed the meeting, he told the mayor and city council members that he had learned more in this one meeting with Bob Cobb than he had in all the conversations he had over the previous months with anybody from Los Angeles. And he dug his heels in and he said, it's going to have to be in Chavez Ravine. That's where I want to be. Because the city didn't want to have to spend that kind of money. They were hoping he would accept playing in Wrigley Field. That was a non-starter for O'Malley. Others thought, well, he could just play in the Coliseum. And as a permanent solution, that was a non-starter for O'Malley. He didn't like the layout, had no box seats, press box. It would take millions to get it to where it needed to be to meet major league standards. And it really just wasn't going to be acceptable. He just was adamant it had to be in Chavez Ravine. So ultimately, it came to be that Dodger Stadium was built, and its origins were Bob Cobb and the Hollywood Stars. So when the Dodgers made their announcement that they were coming, it meant the end of both the Hollywood Stars and the Los Angeles Angels. The Dodgers bought the Angels and moved them to Spokane, Washington. Hollywood, Bob Cobb initially wanted to move just south to Long Beach, where they were building a ballpark, Blair Field. And the city told him that if he would come, they could expand it. It was still early in the construction phase. And he looked at it, but the Coast League didn't want to do it. The Coast League was seeing the opportunity for a power shift to the Northwest. And the owners of those clubs up in the Northwest realized they could minimize a lot of their travel expenses. Ralph Kiner was running the San Diego Padres at that time, and he was adamant that he wanted to see the club in Long Beach so they would have a travel partner. And he threatened that he would take the Padres and move them into the Texas League if they didn't agree to let the Hollywood Stars move to Long Beach. But in the end, the Coast League turned that idea down, and they forced Cobb to sell, and he sold it to a group in Salt Lake City. And as Cobb said, people asked him if he was going to get involved with the Dodgers, and he said, I got my chili parlor to run. Later, his good friend Gene Autry was granted an American League expansion team. And while Cobb was an avid supporter of the Dodgers when they won their first pennant, he was the only business owner in Los Angeles to take out a full-page ad congratulating the team on behalf of the Brown Derby. Had box seats there. But when the Angels started up, his allegiance was to his friend, Gene Autry, and his former manager, Fred Haney, who was the initial general manager of the American League Angels. So as his grandson told me, he said, my grandfather would take me to the games, first at the old Wrigley Field and then at Dodger Stadium. And he said, Grandpa would get me set up in the boxes and then he'd disappear. And a few years later, when I was a little older, I understood that he disappeared because he could drink liquor up in the box with Gene Autry and Fred Haney. So the legacy of the Hollywood Stars, the legend of the Hollywood Stars, wrapped up when they moved to Salt Lake City. And for me, I just felt it was an honor to get to know the people I got to know in researching this, the many members of the families who were so excited to see the story told. Bob Cobb's grandson was such great help and had such great stories, and it was a real treat to be able to share this story. So thank you for letting me share the story with all of you, and I'm certainly open to questions and conversation.
Well, thank you, Dan. James Winberg up here. James Winberg, just wanted to say thank you very much for that presentation. And I have one question here. You mentioned that Major League Baseball said only Wrigley Field, Los Angeles would have been acceptable. But what was the problem with Seal Stadium in San Francisco?
It was a little landlocked as far as parking goes, James. And that was one that was real borderline. That was the only other one that came close. The capacity was not what, and I can't remember what the criteria was capacity-wise, but Seals was a terrific ballpark. In fact, George Genovese always told me that he loved playing there, and that he always said that he thought that the Giants were fools, that they should have just put a second deck on it. But I think the problem was it was landlocked. There wasn't a lot of parking, and that was going to be a big problem in terms of having a major league park on that site.
Thank you.
You bet. Thank you.
And I couldn't help but wonder if Earl Gilmore had any connection to James Gilmore, who had been the Federal League president in 1914, 1915. I'm not finding anything that indicates that they had any relationship at all, but was just curious if there was anything there.
You know, that's interesting. I'll have to ask, because I speak to people that work for his company. I don't know how many of you have spent time in Los Angeles, but they have a famous kind of a market that's kind of a nice tourist mecca called the Farmers Market, the original Farmers Market. And the Gilmores started that, and it was right across the street from the ballpark. People have asked where the ballpark was, where Gilmore Field was, and it was on the site of what is now CBS, CBS Television City. In fact, I was talking to Marilyn Rowe, whose husband Don pitched both for the Pirates and for Hollywood in 56 and 57. And she was telling me a few years ago that some of her friends took her to a taping of a show. And as they walked into the large studio, a friend pointed to a plaque on the floor, and it noted, and it was put in by the local SABR, PCL group and the SABR chapter, and it noted that that was where home plate was in Gilmore Field. But Earl Gilmore was a big oil man, had the largest chain of gas stations up and down the West Coast, which he later sold. But he was he knew publicity, and he had cars at the Indianapolis 500. Sponsored air racing. He was involved in a lot, but Federal League, that's an interesting one. I'll have to check that out. I'll let you know what I find out.
Okay.
And Karen, being a Pirates fan, there were a lot of great Pirates that came through Gilmore Field, and I talked to people who were teenagers then, and they still talk about how mesmerized they were watching Bill Mazeroski. And he was only with the Stars for about 3 months before going up in July to the big leagues for good. And these guys played infield with their high school teams and their college teams, and they said that they were always just in awe, and their eyes very rarely left Bill Mazeroski when he was in the field.
Oh, well, that's neat.
Although one did tell me he was a shortstop in high school and college, and he did talk a lot about Mazeroski, but he said that he would stop watching Mazeroski when Bing Crosby and his wife would walk by. And he said, and Dan, it had nothing to do with Bing. In fact, another one told me that, like a lot of kids, they would try to gather up the seat cushions at the end of a game because they could turn them in for money. And one of the kids said that, guys told me that as a kid, he would always make a beeline for Bing's row so he could just kind of enjoy looking at Bing's wife. Well, thanks everybody. This has been fun to talk about it. Yes, fire
Quick
away.
question.
I love your hat because I'm a huge Expos fan.
Okay. I'm in central Pennsylvania, but always get a lot of comments on this hat. So it's always
My jacket and hat and jersey are in the closet behind me, aren't it?
quick question. The PCL through the years at times was almost known as like like another major league in terms of, the caliber of it. And, by the early 50s, was that still the case, or was it more of a true minor league? Where was the competition?
I think by the mid 50s, it had started to change, but you had clubs, the Angels and Hollywood were kind of at the forefront, Portland, San Francisco, that were very aggressive in terms of scouting and trying to get out and sign young amateur players in their area. You had most of the clubs at that top level, they were taking the big league guys that were really at the end of the road, and the big league clubs would sell to them. And or they would, back then, the way minor league affiliations worked was you could hook up with a big league parent club, but they would send you anywhere from 4 to 6 players. That was all. Not like today. Mm-hmm. So the most you would get was just a small handful of players, and you were really at the mercy of the big league club as to who they would send to you. So Hollywood and the business manager of Hollywood Stars was a guy named Oscar Reichow. And he had also run the Angels. And when he ran the Angels, it was really interesting because the high schools in LA in the 30s were really struggling financially. And it seemed like every year they were having meetings about whether or not they would have the money to even field high school baseball programs in Los Angeles. And so Reichow was really good about going after young players. I mean, Bobby Doerr signed from Fremont High as a sophomore. So with Hollywood, Cobb loved to get out and watch baseball as well. And so the two of them really struck on an interesting plan. And they one of the things they created, which is still around today, although under a different name now with what happened this offseason, but the California League, the high A which for 80 years has been a high A league and maybe one of the best high A leagues in minor league baseball. Well, that was created by the Hollywood Stars, because they wanted to get into their own player development and kind of wean themselves away from buying these broken down big leaguers. They wanted to develop their own players, and they felt that could help them achieve major league status as well. And the war really hurt Hollywood's effort there, because they had some really, really good young prospects that they had begun signing 39, 40, 41. And then these young guys got drafted into the military. And when they came back, some were injured. Some didn't want to play ball anymore, and things changed. But so, yeah, they were really aggressively trying to get out and sign amateur players. And they had good young talent. I mean, as you know, San Francisco, look at all the great players they sold to the New York Yankees, Joe DiMaggio being the biggest name. But by the 50s, many of the clubs had become more and more reliant on big league teams to provide them with players. And there was a lot of disagreement within the league, because they felt if they were going to become a big league, a major league, they had to develop their own talent. And the Angels were owned by Wrigley, so they were really a Cubs farm team. 100% of their players throughout the following World War II were players owned by the Chicago Cubs. Sacramento had been a Cardinals farm team. So I think by the mid 50s, it really changed. But the money was a real key factor. I mean, Steve Bilko was hitting 50 plus home runs year after year after year for the LA Angels. And he didn't want to go to the big leagues. I mean, he was one of the biggest names in Los Angeles and was making big money. I mean, George Genovese told me when he was taken in the minor league, the Rule 5 draft after the 49 season by the Senators, and he sat down and negotiate, and they gave him an offer of $5,000. And he said, I made $6,000 in the Coast League. And they said, well, you're a rookie. That's the major league minimum. You got to take it if you want to play in the big leagues. And he argued, and they said, well, you played more games in the Coast League. This is the offer, take it or leave it. So yeah, the Coast League, the salaries were good. The life was good. Players loved it. And young guys, there were young guys that were frustrated when they were drafted or sold to big league clubs.
Thank you.
Sure.
Sport magazine in the early 1950s ran a feature article about Chuck Connors. And the general gist of the article was, he said he would rather play in Los Angeles and with the Chicago Cubs. He was happy in the minor leagues. Yeah, it was a very good article.
You know, it's funny that you mentioned that. I can't think of the name of the other first baseman, but when Chuck was originally sent to the Angels by the Cubs, the fans were really upset about it because the first baseman who went up to the big leagues, I can't recall the name now, he was really popular with the fans. And in time, Chuck, brought him around. But it was a great place for him. He did well. It was the quality of ball, the stadium, everything was terrific. And Chuck Connors had I don't know if you saw this in that article or if you've seen it in other articles, but Chuck Connors lived way out in what was the country then. And so he struck an arrangement with an African-American family who lived right across the street from Wrigley Field. And after Saturday night games, they would let him stay in their guest room because Sundays in the Coast League were always afternoon doubleheaders. And so it saved him having to make this long drive out to Encino, I think was where his ranch was, or his ranch home was. But George Genovese told me the great story because he knew Chuck Connors from growing up in New York. George was from Staten Island. So in high school, they would play in all-star games against one another. And then can't recall if it was the Sally League or the Carolina League. Right before the war, they were both in that league, and they would get together for dinner whenever their teams played. And he told me that in 51, in a game against the Angels, George drew a walk and trotted to first base. And Chuck Connors came over to the bag and he was punching his glove. And he leaned over. He goes, George, you're not going to believe it. I got an agent. I'm getting into pictures. I'm going to get out of baseball. and he had accepted a deal to have a bit part. I don't know if you've ever seen it on Turner Classic, but the movie's called Pat and Mike. And it starred Spencer Tracy, and he played a small town sheriff in that film. And that was his first acting opportunity. But that was another benefit of playing in Los Angeles because you had casting agents, producers, directors out of the ballparks all the time. And there were a number of Hollywood players that got involved in movies. You look at just about any baseball movie in the 40s and 50s, and the extras are usually Hollywood Stars players. In fact, Irv Noren told me a funny story. There were a number of Hollywood Stars players. I think the movie was Kill the Umpire. Bill Frawley, Fred Mertz on I Love Lucy, was a huge Hollywood Stars fan. He was an investor and he was around the ball club a lot. His drinking got himself in a little trouble. There was one season where a rumor came out that Mickey Cochran, the former A's catcher, was going to be named the new general manager of the Hollywood Stars. And Cobb and Reichow and the staff couldn't figure out where this came from because there was nothing farther from the truth. Well, it turned out that Bill Frawley had been at a banquet and had too much to drink and was talking to Mickey Cochran saying, I'm going to get you this job. And, they had to reel Bill Frawley back in. But anyway, I digress. But so Frawley got a lot of the Hollywood Stars players roles as extras in the movie Kill the Umpire. Well, Irv Noren told me the story that they figured out real fast they were being paid by the day. And on the last day that the players were scheduled to film, at the end of the day, there was a play where Noren in center field was to make a throw to third base. Well, Noren intentionally airmailed the throw a mile over the third baseman's head, so they would automatically have to come back the next day to reshoot the scene, and therefore they would all get an extra day's pay.
Coincidentally, speaking of Irv Noren came from Jamestown, New York, the hometown of Lucille Ball.
That's right. Right. I forgot that. Yeah. He had a wonderful lunch with him about a year before he passed. He was just full of great stories. Talked about how he ended up playing for Hollywood, which is in the book, that he felt being the MVP of the Texas League, he deserved a shot with Brooklyn in spring training, didn't get it, and told Branch Rickey he was quitting. And Noren's parents owned a Danish bakery, or it might have been a Swedish bakery in Pasadena. And he said he and his brother were going to market their Swedish bread nationally, sell it to grocery stores all around the country. And Rickey told him to come back the next day and asked the next day how he would feel about playing for Hollywood. And Noren said it was just the greatest opportunity in his career to that point. And had an MVP season and helped the Stars win their first pennant.
Dan, regarding the Pittsburgh Pirates, how did the Hollywood Stars get involved with them?
Well, Stephen, it was through the association with Branch Rickey. Bob Cobb and Branch Rickey became great friends through the association that Hollywood had with the Brooklyn Dodgers. And then when Rickey left the Dodgers and went to the Pirates, Cobb wanted to go with him. He didn't want to stay with Brooklyn. And Buzzy Bavasi, who had succeeded Branch Rickey in Brooklyn, struck a pretty strong deal. I mean, he wanted 12 players in exchange for releasing the Stars from their obligation to the Dodgers. And it was a lot of young prospects that Hollywood had signed. The one that ended up spending time in the big leagues was Norm Sherry, who was a big league catcher and longtime coach in the big leagues, just passed away a few months ago. But there were several others that Hollywood young prospects they had in their minor league teams that they ended up surrendering to Brooklyn in order to get out of their player development and go with Pittsburgh. And the Hollywood had signed a lot of their own players, and these guys were fan favorites. Frankie Kelleher was the only Hollywood player to have his number retired. Chuck Stevens was their first baseman for many, many years. These were Hollywood-owned players, but it was with Pittsburgh that Rickey really started to press them to play the Pittsburgh prospects. So Dale Long came in and became the first baseman, and Chuck Stevens was sold, and Kelleher decided to retire as they were filling the outfield with Pittsburgh prospects. So that's when things kind of changed for the Stars.
How, because there was an article, I can't remember, it came out last year, a few years ago, the Browns, St. Louis Browns, one of the westernmost teams in baseball at the time, they almost came to Los Angeles. How would have that affected the way the Pacific Coast League did business, considering that, in some incarnation, the Pacific Coast League, in a way, even though it's not really called it right now, but you still have some teams that play out that far west. How would have had it gone through before everything happened during World War II? How would that affected the way Pacific Coast League, even, and let alone the Hollywood Stars, would have done business, considering that was where they were? That's where they could possibly been going.
Steve, good question. And for those of you that aren't aware, there's been a story out for many years, and it's partly true, that the American League was going to take a vote. And it was going to be on Monday, December 8th, 1941. And they were going to hear a proposal from Don Barnes, the principal owner of the St. Louis Browns, who wanted to move the Browns to Los Angeles. And the attack on Pearl Harbor, they decided that they didn't want to do that. And it was a unanimous no vote on the idea of moving the Browns to Los Angeles. There's more to it. I'll get into that. But to Stephen's question, it would have, the feeling from all the articles I read, the feeling was that it would have killed the Coast League, because Los Angeles was their biggest market, their two most successful teams. And the feeling is that without those two teams and without Los Angeles, the Coast League would have been severely damaged. Now, how likely, how strong was the possibility? I don't think Barnes lived in Hollywood, but I don't think it had a chance without Pearl Harbor. I don't think it had a chance, because the problem back then, as Steve alluded to, there were no teams west of the Mississippi. And so the travel concept was that a team would play in Chicago, board a train after a Sunday game. It was a day and a half train trip from Chicago to Los Angeles. So you would then turn around, you'd play 4 or 5 games, then get back on a train back to Chicago. And the feeling was, without two teams on the West Coast, it was just not going to work. And so the whole travel situation was the big issue for the major leagues. And that's why for many, many years, I mean, you saw this in other leagues, even when the NHL expanded and wanted to get on the West Coast, they had a solid franchise in Los Angeles and the Kings, and they insisted they had to have a second franchise in the Bay Area, and went with the Seals in Oakland. And the Seals were an abysmal failure, but they propped them up to have two teams for travel purposes. It was the same with baseball. It was such a difficult situation and same with football, when the LA Bulldogs were given provisional membership in the NFL in the late 1930s. After this one season where they played 3 or 4 NFL teams, and they beat them all, but when it came up for a vote of making them a full-fledged member, they said the travel's ridiculous. We're in station wagons or buses going from the Midwest out to Los Angeles, and it's just not going to fly. So instead, they chose to take the Cleveland Rams out of the AFL and bring them into the NFL instead of the LA Bulldogs. So travel was always the big issue. I think the idea, Stephen, I think it's great you bring that up. I think the idea that the Browns could have moved. It's kind of been romanticized over the years. I think that the obstacles were far greater than just the Pearl Harbor attack. And then Bill Veeck in '52 tried it again as a desperation move. The American League didn't want Veeck involved, and they had an ownership group in Baltimore, and they wanted to force Veeck to sell that club to the group in Baltimore. And the American League owners didn't want Veeck in the game. And Veeck was trying to scramble for his baseball life and move the club out to Los Angeles, and it didn't happen. But I think from everything I read, the feeling of baseball people was that if they lost the 2 Los Angeles teams, the Stars and Angels, the Coast League would have been in real dire straits.
Regarding the TV show Home Run Derby, which took place at Pacific Coast League Stadium, how did that all develop?
The voice of the Hollywood Stars, Mark Scott. He was their radio announcer for a number of years. His daughter is a wonderful friend, Mary Jane, and she's been a great help on the book. It was a concept that Mark Scott had, and he pitched it to a producer friend. And Mark was another that, joining up with the Stars and also having a show on a radio station in Los Angeles, he became exposed to people in the entertainment industry and had some bit parts in several movies and later in television shows. He had some friends and pitched the concept, and they put it out and found a distributor in Ziff and had a great first season. It went over very, very well. And then very sadly, as they had signed all the papers to do a second season, and Mark Scott had a heart attack in his sleep and passed away. And they elected not to continue Home Run Derby beyond that first season. But one of my best friends is a longtime scout, former bullpen coach of the Giants, John Van Orden. John was one of the batting practice pitchers in Home Run Derby, and he's shared a lot of amazing stories. John and a minor league teammate traded off pitching and catching. And as John says, there have been so many articles. Steve, you've probably seen them out there. There's been so many articles over the years written about Home Run Derby. And a lot of people have taken credit for being batting practice pitchers or catchers or being involved. And every time I see something, I'll run it by John. And he gets disgusted. He says he had nothing to do with it. He watched from the dugout, or he said Tommy Sapple, who was one of John's minor league managers, and he had listed that he was a batting practice pitcher, and he was a former Hollywood outfielder. And John said, yeah, he was there one day. That's all. So, but yeah, he's got some fun stories about the whole Home Run Derby. In fact, I can get John and Mary Jane, and we can come back in a few months and do a whole Saber talk for you guys on Home Run Derby.
Hey, Dan, you mentioned about the pipeline of players that came from the Pacific Coast League during that era to the major leagues. How is that similar for managers? And we were on the subject of broadcasters. What was that pipeline from the Pacific Coast League to the major leagues for broadcasters and managers, just to use an example?
No, it's great, Steve. For broadcasters, I mean, Mark Scott went to the Cincinnati Reds for a year or two. There were a number of I think the first broadcaster that Hollywood hired for the 39 season was a member of the New York Giants team, Joe, and now I can't remember the name. He ended up being a cop on kids shows for a number of years in New York City. I can't think of the last name now, but yeah, there were several broadcasters in the Coast League that ended up moving on. And in terms of managers, my goodness, Casey Stengel, Chuck Dressen, Fred Haney, Bobby Bragan. The game was much different then, because big league teams used the minor leagues to develop managing talent as much as they did playing talent back then. It's not that way anymore. But, George Genovese told me a funny story. Rogers Hornsby was the manager of Seattle in 51. And George says it was hilarious to be out in the field. He said, I'd look into the Seattle dugout from shortstop, and Rogers Hornsby would be in one corner, and all the players would be on the far opposite end of the dugout. And he said Hornsby would never come out to make a pitching change. He would just wave from the dugout. And he said it was very different. But yeah, you had a lot of these guys that came through. When Leo DeRocher sat out, what was it, the 47 season when he was suspended? He flew out to LA to spend time with his buddy George Raft. And he showed up at Gilmore Field to take in some games. And the second night that he showed up at Gilmore Field, a reporter for the Los Angeles Times approached him. And DeRocher said, I'm so impressed with this. I'd love to manage the Hollywood Stars. And of course, it got into print in the LA Times, and DeRocher had to come out with a statement, backing away from that and pledging his allegiance to Branch Rickey and the Brooklyn Dodgers. But it's a good point, Steve. They had a lot of these managers that came through the Coast League that went on and managed very successfully in the major leagues.
Yeah, because I know off the top of my head, Casey Stein was probably maybe the most famous one, because he managed the Oakland Oaks at one
right.
time. What happened to Gilmore Field after the Stars were done? What happened to that stadium?
Well, what had happened is early to mid 50s, Earl Gilmore's oil wells, he had a number of oil wells around Los Angeles, they began to dry up. So he shifted the emphasis of his business to property development. And the acreage that he had there in the Fairfax district, he also had a football stadium right next to the baseball stadium, Gilmore Stadium. And Pepperdine, Loyola, a few colleges played there. The LA Bulldogs, the Hollywood Bears, and the Pacific Coast Football League played there. And but one of their big events was auto racing. Midget auto racing was very popular in there, as was motorcycle racing. But as things changed, Gilmore was approached by people with ideas and interests in his land, and the biggest was CBS. And CBS came to him with a multi-tiered scheme, and the first was they wanted 12 acres on the corner where the football stadium was. And so I think early in mid-50s, he sold that parcel to CBS, and they tore down Gilmore Stadium. And in doing so, they gave them an option on something like another 50 acres. And in those 50 acres was the ballpark. So that was another reason why Cobb was also very keen to find a new site for Gilmore Field. Was his lease with Earl Gilmore was going to expire after the 57 season. And then, of course, with the Dodgers coming in after the 57 season, that took care of all of that. That superseded all of that. But they ended up, it was around for maybe a year. And then the Rams used it as a practice site. I think they held a circus there, a few things like that, and then tore it down in about late 58, early 59. And then that's when CBS set out to build Television City on that site.
Can you talk a little about Wrigley Field? I mean, because I know there's Gilmore Field, and there's also Wrigley Field, where the Angels made their first home early in their franchise.
Well, William Wrigley was one of the wealthiest men in America, and he had mansions all over the country. Huge one in Scottsdale, Arizona, and he owned the island of Catalina Island, off the California coast, off of Long Beach. And he was approached, and I believe it was 1924, he bought the Los Angeles Angels in the Pacific Coast League and had the idea to build a ballpark. And he used the same architect. So the ballpark that was constructed was an exact replica of his Cubs ballpark in Chicago. Now, when I say that Wrigley Field in Los Angeles was the original Wrigley Field, it's not because it was built before the park in Chicago. It's because it was named Wrigley Field before the park in Chicago took the name Wrigley Field. The Chicago park was Cubs Park for many years before Wrigley became the principal owner of the ball club and changed the name, put his own name on it. So the Wrigley Field ballpark seated 21,000. Very, very much a spitting image down to the ivy on the outfield walls of the ballpark in Chicago. It only had a few bleachers in right center field. Otherwise, there was no bleacher seating in the outfield like you'd see at the Chicago ballpark. And it was one of the big problems. It was landlocked. Neighborhoods were all around it. Very little in the way of parking. So that's one of the big reasons the Dodgers didn't want to use it. One of the differences was it had a 12-story tower outside the ballpark, right behind home plate. The Angels had their offices there, and other entities used the office space, and they had huge clocks around the top. The architecture on the exterior was a little bit different, kind of a Spanish motif. But yeah, it was in many ways. You look at it, and that it looks so much like the park in Chicago, and that's why it was very popular with movie producers and directors, because if they were shooting big movies that had to do with baseball. I mean, you look at the Joe E. Brown films, Elmer the Great, whatnot, in the mid 30s, they were in Wrigley Field. You look over the years at many of these baseball themed movies, and especially in the 40s and the 50s, where they were shot in Wrigley Field in Los Angeles.
Because off the top of my head, very early on in the Twilight Zone series, there was
the Mighty Casey.
Yes.
And George Genovese was the third base coach in that one. There's an interesting story to that. They reshot that, and it's kind of a sad story, but it was originally shot at Paul. He played the manager in Angels in the Outfield. I'm trying to think of his last name, but the day after they completed shooting, he died of a heart attack. And so what they decided to do was to completely reshoot his scenes in that movie. And they did it, I believe it was in January, they reshot it. And George had been managing and playing in winter ball in Mexico. And when he came home, they had put out a call for extras. And so he accepted and went over there. He said he hated the experience. He said Wrigley was a big concrete and steel park. And in the wintertime, it became so cold. And he said, when you're an extra, you're just, it's just hurry up and wait. I mean, you're just sitting around all day waiting for your part to be shot. And I told George's granddaughters that he was the third base coach, and he had never told them that story, but he shared that with me. And then when I watched that, he's in there for maybe a fraction of a second. That's all you see him. But yeah, they used Wrigley Field for the Mighty Casey, the Twilight Zone episode.
Yeah, you mentioned about the shorts earlier in the conversation. Who made those shorts?
Was it Rawlings? And the idea was actually Fred Haney's, the manager. A columnist in the Times at the end of the 48 season challenged the Stars to do something unique with their uniforms. And Fred Haney chewed on that all through the off season and came up with the idea. And it was not just the shorts, but the jersey. Instead of the flannel jersey, it was a t-shirt. And so when he opened the boxes and showed them to the players, and there was so much grumbling going on, the way he sold it to them was that it's going to make you faster. Just feel it. It's so much lighter than a standard uniform, and it's going to make you faster. And so the first game in which they used them, Haney coached first base, and Chuck Stevens was the leadoff hitter, and Chuck beat out an infield hit. And as he crossed first base and the umpire signaled safe, Haney thrust his arms into the air, turned to the fans, and hollered, "See, I told you, they work." But it became a real a fan phenomenon up and down the league. People came to the ballparks when they traveled because they wanted to see this unique uniform. But in Seattle, the Rainiers ownerships, they had kind of reneged on the league deal in terms of revenue sharing. And they weren't giving the opposing team the share of the gate that they were supposed to. And so Haney kind of got back at him and didn't bring the shorts and the t-shirts. And they had a sold out house for that game, and the Stars come out with their flannels. And they were really angry and booing and whatnot. And Haney just told him, he said, we only wear that in warm weather. We're not going to wear shorts and t-shirt when it's cool. And then there was a game in Oakland, and the ballpark there was in Emeryville, just off the water. and the players were in the shorts during pregame and in the top of the first inning. And after the top half of the first inning, they came back in the dugout and they said to Haney and said, it's too cold out here. We got to change. And he let them go do it. When they came back out in the flannels, where the fans were irate, but that was kind of how they worked it out. If the weather was good, they would wear them. And if they were in a city and the weather wasn't, they wouldn't. But and it became, Steve, your question was really interesting because the two different manufacturers took out competing ads in the sporting news throughout that summer. And they were trying to up each other on price on their own version of short baseball pants.
Because I did not know about my first recollection, as far as one of my earliest recollections of baseball, was the White Sox wearing shorts. And I remember opening up a book about sporting news, right, as far as trivia and records from the mid to early 1980s. And it showed this picture of Fred Haney before he became the Milwaukee Braves manager wearing these shorts in the game. I thought, no, wait a minute. But I was just out of curiosity when you started to talk about, how the shorts came to be a part of, briefly part of the Hollywood Stars, what they wore. That's what got me curious as far as, the manufacturers, and all that stuff. You mentioned a few of the celebrities. Were there a lot of celebrities that went to Gilmore Field to stars?
A lot. Seen a lot of pictures, and listening to players and people that went to games. I'll tell you a funny story. I was doing a Zoom talk to a Rotary Club in the Pasadena area several months ago. And I told the story that one of the things that Hollywood did in the 50s, like a lot of minor league teams all around the country, they had an annual beauty pageant. And Miss Hollywood stars would make public appearances and do various things at the ballpark during games. A lot of minor league teams did it. And I said, what was different about Hollywood was that the movie studios would enter new actresses that they had just signed a contract because they saw this as a way to get them exposure and publicity. And I said, Miss Hollywood Stars in 1956 was Jane Mansfield. And this woman in the club pipes up and she said, I am so glad you told that story because I was once one of those starlets. And you see everybody in the club just in total shock. And I said, she said the studio would have the established male actors escort the new female actresses to games. And so it might be the fights at the Olympic Auditorium. It might be the Hollywood Stars games. And she said, George Raft escorted her to a Hollywood Stars game. And I stopped and I said, I don't know why I'm giving this talk, because if you were with George Raft, I would much rather hear your stories. And there were people in the club that were saying, well, you've got to write a book about her because she's got to have great stories. And it may be the only way we find out about them. So, but it was a different atmosphere. And Jimmy Stewart and his family were there and they weren't bothered. That's the thing that's amazing. It's a lot different than probably what would happen today. But the celebrities were there. The fans didn't bother them. I've heard different stories from players. And it wasn't just that they showed up at the park, but they connected with the players. Chuck Stevens told me stories about Jimmy Stewart and his wife having Chuck and his wife to their home several times for dinner. Gail Patrick, who was Bob Cobb's first wife, and she created the whole Perry Mason TV series. She was a very famous actress in the 1930s. And with her, I believe, third husband, they had a huge mansion. And Mondays were always the off day, the travel day in the Coast League. And she and her husband would throw barbecues and pool parties for the Hollywood players and their wives. I remember seeing the little note that George Genovese received from her. So it was very common. There were celebrities. Bing Crosby would take players out golfing. I mean, the movies, the players that I talked to about this said the thing that always shocked them when they initially joined the Stars was how amazing it was that these movie stars were as big of fans of them as they were of the movie stars. And these were minor league players. These were not big league guys. So Yeah, it was quite a wonderful environment.
Hey, regarding Gilmore Stadium, is there an historical marker to indicate that baseball was played there after it was torn down?
Yeah, it's in one of the studios. I briefly mentioned it earlier that Marilyn Rowe, whose husband pitched for Hollywood, was taken to a taping of a show, and her friend that took her pointed out on the ground in the studio the marker. Now, what we're hearing from some family members that work for CBS is that that complex is coming down, that CBS is going to outsource and offshore a lot of the things that they do at that current site. And so I've let the PCL guys and the SABR chapter down there know, because the 3 or 4 guys that were instrumental in getting that placed, they want to get in there and get it back and then work with the new developer, because I think it's going to be residential stuff that's going to go in there, some condos and stuff. And so they want to be able to replace it when the new project is done.
Would you like to have that in your living room?
I'll take it, but my
Yeah,
wife
I
might
know.
not like it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But yeah, that's kind of fun, because you see that up and down the coast. I haven't been over to Wrigley. It's not in the best area of Los Angeles, but a friend has said we're going to go over there one of these days. Of course, with the pandemic, I haven't been down there in a while, but we'll go over there because there is a marker in a park where it used to be. And then I've been to San Diego, where the marker is, and they've done the SABR chapter there did an amazing job, because they actually carved out an infield, and it's a very small park, and it's called Lane Park. That's where Lane Field was. It's right off where the cruise ships dock, and they've got a home plate and a marker there, and bases and a pitcher's mound, and they've done a great job of signifying where Lane Field was. And I'm told they've got a marker where Seal Stadium was, and a marker over in Oakland and Seattle and Portland as well.
Well, thank you, Dan. We've had you talking for quite a while. You probably
Well, as you can kind of guess, I can talk. God, that I wish I'd heard from is Frank, because I love your garden. I've got to do some re-landscaping, and I'm looking for ideas, so I might have to get your email.
That's my wife's handiwork.
Okay, well, it looks terrific.
I do have a question for you, Dan. The rest, the teams, the other teams in the league, how financially successful or viable were they? Outside the major metropolitan areas.
Well, it just seemed that Sacramento was always struggling. I know during the war years they were getting 300 to a game at best, and they were in a real difficult spot. Sacramento was always a club that was looking for a new owner and having trouble. And Portland was the other one that seemed to change hands a lot. Seattle was a big beer baron, Emil Sick Stadium. He was their owner. San Francisco, for the most part, they did change owners, but they were pretty stable. In the 50s, Oakland, they moved to Vancouver in the late 50s. So they hit on some hard times over there. Of course, LA with Wrigley, that was as deep pocketed as it gets. Hollywood was very secure financially. And then San Diego, Bill Lane passed away, and there became a bit of a turnover there. But for the most part, they were in good shape down there. So really, Sacramento was the troubled franchise, and then Portland seemed to kind of be up and down.
Did teams move from cities to cities when they hit financial problems?
For the most part, it was stable. Now they had, in the early years of the Coast League, they had a club in Salt Lake City, and that club moved to LA and was the first incarnation of the Hollywood Stars. That was Bill Lane's club, and then he was sharing Wrigley with the Angels, and the Angels got tired of it and pretty much booted him out. And that's when he moved to San Diego. The club that was Hollywood, the second incarnation, the Celebrity Stars, they actually started in the LA area as the Vernon Tigers. Vernon was it was the meat packing district in an industrial area. Yeah. And then they moved to San Francisco. Herbert Fleischhacker, a banker, bought that club, moved it to San Francisco, and they played in 2 or 3 different places, had some different names, the Mission Bells, the Mission Reds, the Missions. And then ultimately, Fleischhacker got tired of playing second fiddle at the Seals and thought that he could get something going in LA, moved them to Los Angeles. But at the time that he moved them, he got hit with some massive investor lawsuits over some deals of the bank, and he lost those lawsuits. and had to sell the ball club. And that's when Bob Cobb and his celebrity group ended up buying it. So for the most part, there wasn't much movement. Now, of course, after 57, that's when everything changed with the San Francisco Seals moved to Phoenix. The Oaks had previously, a couple of years earlier, left Oakland and moved to Vancouver. The Dodgers bought the LA. Well, they actually swapped franchises with Wrigley. Wrigley took over Fort Worth, and O'Malley took over the LA Angels. And so then O'Malley moved the Angels to Spokane, and then Cobb sold the Stars to the group in Salt Lake City. And so that was the biggest movement, was the winter after the 57 season. But before then, no, it had been very stable for a good 25, 30 years.
And O'Malley swapped with Wrigley because he wanted the territorial rights to the Dodgers.
Right. And Wrigley didn't want to be a bad guy and look like he was delaying or holding up Major League Baseball coming to the West Coast. So where he could have gotten a lot of money, both for his ballpark and for his team, he just did a swap. And O'Malley had sold the ballpark in Fort Worth like he had sold Ebbets Field. And so Wrigley ended up taking over the Fort Worth operation, and O'Malley took control of the Angels and Wrigley Field.
Thank you.
Hey, Dan, can you tell us about Gene Autry, how he got involved with the Angels?
Okay, I'll give you the story that's probably never been published. You guys get the exclusive. This came from Bob Cobb's grandson, who got it from Bob Cobb, who was great friends with Gene Autry.
And I'll remind you we're recording, so.
Well, everybody's dead, so I don't think it's going to come back to bite me.
Okay.
I have to go, but this is a great time. And I love the stories.
Thank you, Karen. Thanks for being here.
Yes, and have a good day.
Thanks.
Karen.
Autry had been one of the original investors in the Stars and loved baseball. Over time, many of the original investors in the Stars either sold out or died, and Cobb pretty much became the largest shareholder in the ball club. But he remained great friends with Autry, and so when Autry got the Angels, Cobb was on an advisory board or their board of directors, but he didn't want to have any investment role in the ball club. But the story of how Autry got the Angels was the American League had given Hank Greenberg that expansion team. They had awarded the Los Angeles American League expansion team to Hank Greenberg, the former Detroit and Pittsburgh slugger. Well, nobody ever bothered to talk to Walter O'Malley about this. And this is all heavily documented. And so Greenberg he had always wanted a club in LA. He tried on a couple of occasions to buy the Hollywood Stars because Greenberg had married the daughter of the owner of Gimbel's department store. And so, thank you, Mike. And she wanted to live in Beverly Hills. And so Greenberg was really keen to get a ball club in LA. And Cobb wouldn't sell. Greenberg offered the Stars way more than minor league clubs were going for. And the first effort was in 48, and they wouldn't do it. They wouldn't sell. So he gets the American League expansion team. And now he realizes after he has paid for this team that now he's got to deal with O'Malley on the territorial rights issue. And so he meets with O'Malley, and O'Malley's playing hardball with him. I mean, he wanted some serious coin for allowing the Angels to come into Los Angeles. And Greenberg was taken aback. And I don't know whether he thought that the league had already resolved this, but the league dumped it all on him. He had to resolve it himself. And he walked away from the franchise right as the winter meetings were starting. He walked away from it, and they were shocked. So Gene Autry had flown back because he owned a number of radio stations. And KMPC, his primary flagship radio station, had been the Dodgers' flagship radio station up until that season, and the Dodgers had switched to KFI. So Autry thought, okay, got another major league team coming. I want to get their radio rights and get baseball back on my flagship radio station. That was the sole reason that he went back to the winter meetings. Well, if Gene Autry had a vice, it was drinking. And they kept putting more and more in his glass until Gene Autry agreed to take over the American League expansion team. And it was, as I was told, it was a day or two later when he realized what had happened and realized he didn't have the capital to do what needed to be done. And he set out to find a few other investors. I think he got the head of Firestone Tires and a couple of other guys ultimately to come on, but he did not set out to get a ball club, and he did not get the ball club by design. And that story came from Bob Cobb's grandson, which he got it from Bob Cobb. So ultimately, Autry turned out to be an excellent owner. The Angels were an outstanding franchise through the years, and everything worked out, but it was a little rocky start for that club.
Dan, thank you so much. This is
RJ, thanks for the invitation. Nice to meet all of you guys. Stay well, and thank you very much for the opportunity.
Very enjoyable, Dan.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you indeed.